The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by Case IQ, a global provider of whistleblowing case management and compliance solutions. Learn more at caseiq.com. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turteltaub from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us from across Greater Los Angeles from me is Kristy Grant-Hart. Kristy is a speaker, author, and head of advisory at Spark Compliance, which is now owned by Diligence. And today we're going to be talking about due diligence. Kristy, thanks for joining us again. When we were talking about this subject, we were talking about due diligence questionnaires and preparing for this podcast. You mentioned in passing that from yourself, from the vendor side, you had seen some questions that were real doozies. Before we get into sort of the meat of the conversation, can you share with us an example or two?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, Adam, thank you so much for having me on again. I feel like it's been a couple of years, so it's an honor to be back here with you. I've seen some doozies, both that come to us here at Spark Compliance, but certainly with our clients. And the one that I will never forget was one that was asking for the CEO's bank statements for the past 3 months. And I just thought to myself, what are you expecting to see? Like, do you expect him to or her to, it was a him at that time, explain their Neiman Marcus bill, or if they had a bonus, why they got their bonus, or how do you describe it as not bribery? I mean, it was absolutely bonkers. And the other one that I actually see more than that, I've only ever seen that one once, is the certifications that no one in a company has ever, been found guilty of a crime. We work with companies that are 150,000 employees. How in heaven's name can anybody attest to that? And what companies tend to do, and I don't blame them, is just say, nobody's ever been arrested or found guilty here. How can they possibly say yes or no to that officially? So I think those are the kind of things where you see them and just go, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, I have to say, I saw one here where somebody asked us to fill, which is very rare, to fill out some sort of an attestation. And it said along that lines, has anyone ever been convicted or anyone at any of your vendors ever been convicted? And
You're
it's
serious.
like, yeah, I mean, we book 100 different hotels a year probably for various meetings, whatever the number is. It's like, there's no way we could possibly attest to that. So it's a great example as of something that sounds like a good question to ask really is meaningless when it comes right down to it. So what do you think leads to the inclusion of bad questions? Is it not thinking it through, the wrong people asking questions, something else, or all of the above?
I'm going to throw my profession under the bus here, especially the lawyers, bless them, including me. I think there's so much fear of getting it wrong that it feels like if I ask every single question under the sun, I can't miss something. So I'm going to ask every question under the sun. And the other people guilty of this are outside counsel that haven't worked in businesses and are so ultra conservative in giving advice, they feel uncomfortable doing a proper risk-based approach. So between those two things, I think that the people who are drawn to law and compliance tend to be more conservative in their approaches to risk. And because of that, it feels more comfortable to ask everything you can because it's kind of a self-protection instinct, but it's not serving the business or ultimately them. It's just not. And I think that's how we get into this mess.
So who, from a functional perspective, do you think should be involved in writing the questionnaire when it comes to due diligence?
I think it entirely depends on how your process is working. So obviously more and more companies are at least aspiring to get to a single point of truth, one software that manages multiple risk areas. I've seen a lot more aspiring than actually happening that way. So we still see a lot of places where there are multiple different risk assessments happening. So my answer is whomever it is that is in the process of having their risk reviewed should be in the room creating that due diligence questionnaire. So typically, if it is a company-wide, multifaceted way of doing it, procurement's at the center of that. But obviously, whoever it is that their risk area is being evaluated needs to make sure their questions are involved. But hopefully, if there's a large number of questions, somebody has the power to say, you only get 3. You don't get 75 or 210 when it comes to cyber, right? it's definitely a challenge, I think. But the people who own the risk review need to be in the room to make sure they're getting the right answers.
Yeah, and not getting answers to questions that there's no need for or meaningless. I still remember sort of an example of this, and it's not just something in business, government's guilty of it too. Is I was at a conference in Brazil, actually, and the vice president of Mexico was speaking and said that in Mexico, you have to show a birth certificate to start a business, and just
Oh, no.
as why? So, anyway, so how do you keep the questions relevant and illuminating?
I have an absolute rule when we're consulting about this, and it is if the answer doesn't matter for you to say yes or no, don't ask the question. And it's very uncomfortable for people sometimes. But here's the thing: if one of these examples that I see constantly is, do you have a code of conduct, and do you have an anti-bribery policy? Well, first of all, many of your small vendors won't. And if they do or don't, what are you going to do about that? Are you really not going to hire the vendor because they don't have a code of conduct? If you have a supplier code that is part of your onboarding or part of your contracting or contract terms related to compliance, why are you asking for it? And if you ask for it, are you going to review it, and for what? So it's this kind of thing. For me, the rule is if you are going to say no or put in extra mitigation because of the answer, then by all means, keep that question in there. But if the answer is nice to have, pull it out.
Yeah, if it's a nice to have answer is not necessarily as nice to have as you think at the time. So along the lines you talked about like having rules of no more than three questions. How do you decide when is enough and not too much?
Yeah. To be fair, I was talking about those huge questionnaires, and I don't think that compliance questionnaires should only necessarily be requiring three. But when is enough enough and not too much? That's a really hard thing to answer. So what I always try to do is say, look, choose really critical risk-based. What is going to move the needle? What I see a lot of times in the too much section is there will be 20 inputs, and at that point, really important ones don't matter enough to the outcome. So if you're doing a bribery questionnaire, you want to know what country they're in, where it is on the, on the index. You want to know if they're owned by a government official or they're going to be interacting with them. You want to know those things. So ask the questions that really matter and leave it to that.
So along those lines, what to your mind are the questions that really matter that companies really should be asking and not miss in any kind of a third party due diligence questionnaire?
So I think it really matters what type of risk are you putting in scope. We're all used to the bribery world being the beginning of this third party due diligence questionnaire process. So if you're in that world, it's those questions. What country are you in, and where is it on the Transparency International Index? Are you going to be interacting with governments on our behalf? Are you working with a government owned or controlled company? If you're also asking about sanctions, that's in your purview. You can ask if they're doing any kind of selling to sanctioned countries, assuming that you're under U.S. law or control. Are you looking at Cuba? Are you looking at Iran? Many people obviously ask about Russia. And then if you're talking about privacy, you're asking about whether people have access to personal information, whether that's personal health information under HIPAA, or looking at GDPR or UK GDPR about what those definitions of sensitive information are and what kind of bulk you're having. So I think and more we're seeing modern slavery response. So that to me is really managed more easily with adverse media reviews from the software companies. So I think that it really is being thoughtful about what risk areas are you handling, and then those most important questions to properly risk rank individuals. I did want to say one thing about the previous question that I wanted to add on to, which is documenting a risk-based approach. I think that there is far too little of that going on. People will have a thoughtful approach to why they did what they did, and 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years later, the same person isn't at the company. It hasn't been written down. People don't know why the decisions were being made. So as you're taking this risk-based approach, that will help both with the government, God forbid you get in trouble, but it will help everyone else too to understand why you're doing what you're doing in a defensible way. So when you're making these decisions to not have 20 questions, or to not ask whether everyone in the company has ever been arrested or convicted of something, make notes of that so that you have it in the future and you can defend why you did what you did.
Well, and I've heard a prosecutor say the same thing. I remember during the height of the pandemic doing a podcast, and I can't remember if it was on something healthcare specific or it was something like FCPA. And the person said, look, we know you can't do what you normally would, but document why you did what you did so that if something gets revealed 5 years from now, nobody's going to remember why you did it that way unless you have the documentation and can remind people, hey, back then it was the pandemic. You weren't allowed to travel to that country. So there was no way we could go there, or this process wasn't feasible. Whatever it was, it's always good to have that documentation there. I have to say, one of the more common themes in all the discussions I've had with compliance people is the importance of documentation so that people will have the record of not just what you did, but why you did it. Well, Kristy, once again, it's been great talking with you, and thanks for sharing your perspective here. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turteltaub from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.